On the 4th of May 2026, in the heat and haze above the Strait of Hormuz, the United States military made a decision that looked strange even by Gulf standards. Instead of announcing a classic convoy escort for trapped merchant ships, it assembled a defensive shield built from guided missile destroyers, helicopters, unmanned platforms, and more than 100 aircraft spread across sea and sky. That should not have happened, at least not in the form most people expected, because warships usually protect commercial vessels by staying close to them, not by building an airborne wall around an entire choke point. Yet as radar screens glowed, radios crackled, and crews waited in the dark for orders to move, Washington chose a method that changed the entire equation. If you're proud of the sailors, aviators, and watchstanders who carry that burden, comment proud below, because what happened next was not only about ships. It was about whether global trade could move without igniting a wider war. To understand why that choice mattered, you have to start with the water itself. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane. It is a narrow, tense, heavily watched corridor between Iran to the north and Oman and the United Arab Emirates to the south, a place where geography compresses traffic and turns distance into vulnerability. In 2024, about 20 million barrels per day of oil moved through this passage, roughly 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption, while over 1/5 of global LNG trade also depended on it. That means every tanker delayed there is not merely a ship delay. It is a refinery schedule thrown off in Asia, an insurance premium climbing in Europe, a fuel price jump in the United States, and a reminder that a few miles of water can still pressure the entire world economy. By early May, the atmosphere around the strait had become something colder than a crisis and hotter than a standoff. Reports described hundreds of ships bottled up in the Persian Gulf, while broader estimates put as many as 2,000 ships and 20,000 seafarers in the wider trap created by the disruption. Some crews had been stuck long enough for basic supplies to become part of the story. Food, drinking water, sanitation, fatigue, and fear were no longer background details. They were operational facts. On commercial bridges, watch officers were staring into the same metallic horizon day after day, hearing rumors of mines, drones, missile strikes, and fresh warnings from Iranian commanders. In military operations centers, the light was all blue screens and filtered voices, but the tension was physical. Everyone knew the problem was no longer theoretical. Civilian shipping had become leverage. The obvious answer, at least to anyone thinking in historical images, would have been to bring warships alongside merchant hulls and run convoys straight through the danger zone. That is the picture people remember from the late Cold War and the tanker wars of the 1980s. Steel near steel, escorts close enough to reassure the captain on the bridge and intimidate the attacker over the horizon. But the Gulf in 2026 was not a clean replay of 1987. The threat had changed. Missiles could come from shore launchers. Drones could appear with little warning. Fast attack boats could scatter, regroup, and rush from different angles. Mines could be laid by small craft indistinguishable from normal maritime clutter until it was too late. The waterway itself was narrow, the commercial lanes narrower still, and the enemy's tools were cheap, mobile, and dispersed. That is why the normal solution started to look like the wrong one. In a tight channel, a close escort does not simply protect a merchant ship. It also traps the escort in the same geometry. A destroyer beside a tanker has less room to maneuver, less space to react, and a greater chance of being forced into a sudden escalation at short range. Analysts pointed out that the usable traffic lanes for tankers are far smaller than the full width of the strait, which makes traditional convoy operations especially awkward and dangerous there. Add in the possibility of mobile missile launchers, drones launched from unpredictable points, and the constant risk of mines, and the old answer begins to look expensive, rigid, and vulnerable. That was the first contradiction. The safer-looking option was no longer necessarily the safer one. Then came the political framing. President Trump announced what he called Project Freedom, saying the United States would begin helping free up ships stranded in the Strait of Hormuz and would guide them safely out of the restricted waterways. He described it as a humanitarian move for neutral countries whose crews had been trapped at sea. On the surface, that language sounded restrained, even simple. But military professionals would have heard the hidden difficulty immediately. Guiding ships is easy to say and brutally hard to execute when the other side warns that foreign military forces entering the strait will be targeted. The strategic question was no longer whether the United States wanted to move commerce. It was whether it could reopen movement without creating a direct, ship-to-ship confrontation that would snap the crisis into open war. This is where the decision started to separate operators from spectators. Instead of putting all its emphasis on hugging merchant ships with escorts, U.S. Central Command described something broader and more layered. Admin Brad Cooper said the force would include guided missile destroyers, over 100 land and sea-based aircraft, multi-domain unmanned platforms, and 15,000 service members. He described the mission as inherently defensive and made clear that the military was not formally escorting individual ships in the classic sense. That single clarification explains the logic better than any slogan. The United States was not trying to build a convoy. It was trying to build a battle space. At first glance, that still sounds excessive. More than 100 aircraft to help merchant ships move through a narrow waterway feels like overkill. And that is exactly why many analysts doubted the logic. They knew the Navy had used escorts before. They knew destroyers could defend against missiles. They knew carriers bring power, but also cost, visibility, and strategic risk. So the paradox sharpened. The United States had methods that looked more direct, more traditional, and more familiar. Why choose the option that seemed larger, more diffuse, and harder for the public to visualize? Why build an umbrella when a convoy appears simpler? And why do it in a theater where every extra military asset could be misread as preparation for escalation rather than protection? The answer begins when you run the math instead of the imagery. A convoy model scales poorly. During Operation Earnest Will in 1987, the first convoy of only 2 commercial ships involved 5 U.S. Navy and Coast Guard escorts. That ratio is punishing, and it becomes even worse when today's Navy has to divide destroyers among carrier protection, missile defense, regional presence, and other commitments. CNN cited analysts saying the U.S. simply does not have the assets for traditional convoy operations at the scale the Gulf might demand. Once you see that, the problem changes shape. If dozens or even hundreds of commercial movements must eventually be reassured, you cannot solve it by stapling a destroyer to every hull. You need a way to defend the corridor rather than the individual silhouette. That is what the 100 aircraft shield was designed to do. The aircraft were not there as decoration and not merely to intimidate. They allowed the United States to stretch awareness, response time, and defensive reach across the entire strait. Fighters such as F-15s, F-16s, F-18s, and F-35s could respond to airborne threats and deter surface aggression. EA-18 Growlers could interfere with hostile systems and complicate attacks electronically. RC-135 aircraft could contribute intelligence and situational awareness. KC-46 and KC-135 tankers could keep the air picture alive by extending time on station. Helicopters like the AH-64 Apache and MH-60 Seahawk could move fast against small boats where seconds matter and where a destroyer's geometry is not always ideal. Under, on, and above the water, unmanned systems added more eyes, more persistence, and more ways to find danger before it arrived at the side of a merchant ship. Once you think in layers, the physics becomes clearer. A missile threat is most dangerous when you discover it late. A swarm boat attack is most dangerous when you wait until the boats are already close. A mine is most dangerous when you assume the channel is clean, because it looked clean yesterday. So the objective was not merely to defend at the last second. It was to push detection outward, push decision-making earlier, and push interception farther from the vulnerable civilian hull. That is why a destroyer's missile defense radar matters. But it matters even more when paired with aircraft overhead, electronic warfare support, surveillance platforms, and helicopters ready to pounce on small surface contacts. One sensor cues another. One platform hands off to another. The kill chain is not one weapon firing. It is a sequence of seeing, classifying, deciding, and acting faster than the attacker can close the gap. There was another reason the umbrella mattered, and it had nothing to do with glamour. According to Cooper, U.S. forces had already used specialized technology and low observable capabilities over previous weeks to clear underwater mines and create a free lane through the Strait. That detail is easy to miss, but it changes the story. If the channel itself is part of the fight, then close escort is not enough. The environment has to be shaped. Lanes must be surveyed. Threats must be stripped away before the merchant ship ever arrives. The 100-aircraft shield was therefore not just about shooting things down. It was about maintaining a defensible passage in a battle space where the enemy could threaten from multiple domains at once. But that is only half the equation, because military logic alone does not solve the political cost. A broad air and sea umbrella allows the United States to defend shipping while avoiding the most escalatory image of all. American warships physically lash to civilian convoys in a way that practically guarantees direct confrontation if the other side presses. Analysts told CNN that direct escort would force Iran toward a different level of escalation because it would require firing on U.S. warships more openly and more deliberately. A presence operation, by contrast, changes the situation more subtly. It tells commercial shipping that help exists, tells the adversary that attacks can be punished quickly, and leaves just enough ambiguity to avoid cornering everyone at once. In deterrence, posture is not cosmetic. Posture is the message. Now imagine the scenario as it unfolds in real time. A U.S.-flagged merchant vessel begins moving toward the transit corridor after days or weeks of delay. It is still dark enough that the sea looks black from the bridge, with only navigation lights and instrument glow giving the ship any sense of scale. The crew knows the route has been prepared, but nobody on that bridge believes preparation means safety. Above them, unseen to most of the mariners, aircraft are already in motion. Tankers are orbiting. Fighters are positioned to respond. Surveillance assets are searching for launches, wakes, emissions, and anomalies. Destroyers in the region are not there to lead a parade. They are there to anchor missile defense, add radar depth, and help create the air defense umbrella that makes movement possible. In the first minute of a threat sequence, nothing dramatic may be visible from the merchant deck at all. That is the nature of modern naval defense. A surface search contact appears somewhere beyond the horizon. An emission is detected. A drone track behaves oddly. A small cluster of boats starts moving in a pattern that does not match civilian traffic. The first response is not panic. It is classification. Who is it? What is it doing? How fast is it closing? Can it launch? Can it mine? Can it deceive? The value of the umbrella is that this process begins before the merchant crew even knows a problem is developing. Time is being bought invisibly. By the second or third minute, the response chain hardens. If the threat is airborne, fighters and shipboard defenses can be cued. If the threat is electronic, support aircraft can begin shaping the environment. If the threat is a small boat swarm, helicopters become decisive because they can close quickly, identify clearly, and act before the boats reach effective attack range. Cooper said AH-64 Apaches and MH-60 Seahawks were used to eliminate 6 Iranian small boats threatening commercial shipping. That one fact is the scenario in miniature. A destroyer protects broadly, but the helicopter solves the close, fast, messy problem in front of the merchant hull. Each layer does what the other cannot do alone. If missiles enter the picture, the logic compresses further. Detection and warning have to happen early because interception windows are short and geometry is unforgiving. This is where destroyers, airborne surveillance, and fighters stop being separate assets and become one system. The destroyer's job is no longer just to defend itself. It contributes to the defense of the corridor. Airborne sensors extend the battle space. Fighters shorten reaction time. Tankers extend endurance so the shield does not flicker at the worst possible moment. What looks like excess from a distance begins to look like the minimum once you understand that every missed cue, every empty station, and every late interception multiplies the risk to civilian shipping. Then comes the outcome that matters most. CENTCOM said 2 U.S.-flagged merchant vessels successfully transited the Strait of Hormuz as the first step under Project Freedom, and Reuters reported that a Maersk subsidiary's U.S.-flagged vehicle carrier completed the transit with U.S. protection. That is not the end of a crisis. It is the first crack in a paralysis. When the first ship moves, the argument changes. The question is no longer whether passage is impossible. It becomes whether passage can be repeated, scaled, ensured, and trusted. That is why the first transit in any reopening effort is psychologically larger than the ship itself. It is proof of concept, but only just enough to keep everyone nervous. And still, nothing about it was easy. Shipping executives and analysts warned that commercial trust would depend not just on one movement, but on whether the environment felt sustainably safer and whether insurers believed the logic would hold. That is the uncomfortable truth of maritime strategy. You can clear a lane, build a shield, and move a ship, and still fail if the market decides the risk remains unacceptable. In that sense, the 100-aircraft shield was not simply a military solution. It was an attempt to manufacture confidence under fire. Confidence for captains, confidence for crews, confidence for insurers, confidence for the global economy. This is where the reversal becomes clear. The wrong choice was actually the only scalable one. A direct escort looks strong because it is visible and intuitive, but it is narrow, asset-hungry, and tactically constraining in a place like Hormuz. The broad umbrella looks abstract, but it turns weakness into advantage. The Navy did not need to be everywhere beside every merchant hull. It needed to be far enough, high enough, and networked enough to control the corridor around them. What seemed less direct was actually more flexible. What seemed more complicated was actually more efficient. And what seemed like an oversized response was, in reality, the price of keeping a modern choke point open against layered threats. There is also a larger doctrine hiding inside this decision. The operation was described as defensive, but its real strategic content was denial and control. Denial means making it hard for the adversary to close the waterway cheaply. Control means shaping the conditions so commerce can move without requiring total conquest of the battle space. In practical terms, that matters because the Strait of Hormuz is too important to abandon and too dangerous to solve with brute force alone. Roughly 1/5 of global oil and a major portion of LNG trade pass through that artery. If it stays blocked, the economic effects cascade outward. If it is reopened recklessly, military escalation can do the same. The shield was built because both failure and overreaction carried unacceptable costs. Seen that way, the 100-aircraft decision was not about brute power at all. It was about using the right mix of reach, timing, persistence, and restraint to protect movement without making war inevitable. The pilots mattered. The destroyer crews mattered. The operators in the radar rooms and command centers mattered. But so did the merchant sailors who waited for permission to move, knowing that the machinery of strategy above them existed for one purpose: to give an ordinary ship a narrow chance to complete an ordinary transit through an extraordinary crisis. In military history, that is often the highest form of success. Not the battle you win loudly, but the catastrophe you prevent quietly. The lesson, then, is simple enough to remember even if it took enormous complexity to execute. This was not about power for its own sake. It was about strategy. About understanding that in the missile and drone age, The safest place for a warship is not always glued to the ship it protects, and the strongest posture is not always the most obvious one. Force can clear a path for a moment. Intelligence, integration, and timing can keep that path open. Somewhere in the Gulf, under red bridge lighting and the hum of engines finally turning a trapped hull back toward open water, that distinction became very real. And this is not the only equation the Navy is solving in narrow seas. There are others, and some may matter even more.